Hello everyone! Today I'd like to show you how to make a super easy Chinese dessert called ginger milk pudding. It's very simple and extremely quick to make. This dessert requires very few ingredients: whole milk, ginger, and sugar, which we can add according to however sweet we want it to be. It also requires very few materials to work with. We need ramekins to hold the pudding, a small pot to boil the milk, a grater to grate the ginger, and some filter paper to separate the ginger juice from the ginger itself. So let's start. We begin with a large piece of ginger and a spoon which we will use to peel the ginger. We can take the spoon and gently scrape along the side of the ginger. Here we can see that the skin actually comes off quite easily. By using a small spoon instead of a regular fruit peeler, we're able to keep a larger portion of the ginger. It means that less goes to waste. If you find that the ginger is a bit hard to peel, you can try flipping it around and adjusting the spoon so that it becomes easier to peel. Ginger is the most important ingredient in this dessert. Since this ginger milk pudding only contains 2 ingredients, you might be wondering, what causes the milk to set in the pudding? The answer is, ginger actually contains an enzyme that curdles the milk, which means that it acts as our setting agent in this case. So, we go ahead and try to remove as much of the skin as possible. It's a bit hard to remove the skin around the knobs on the ginger, so you can use a knife or a peeler to make things easier. Once we are done peeling the ginger, we can go ahead and set it aside. We are now ready to move on to the next step. We can proceed by grating the ginger next. We use a very fine grater in order to try to get ginger into as small of a piece as possible. So we begin by taking the grater and bracing it against the side of the bowl to make sure that it's stable, and then we will go ahead and grate the ginger. These smaller pieces of ginger make it easier for us to extract the juice out of later. Now, we're using the grater because we're only creating a small amount of pudding, but if you wanted to create a larger quantity, you could just peel the ginger and put it into a blender or a food processor or whatever you'd like to make a larger amount. Here, we can see that as we grate the ginger, the juice is actually starting to come out and pool at the bottom of the bowl. So we can go ahead and finish up with the grating and try to get as much of it as possible. Now, we can see that as we grate the ginger, a large portion of it actually sticks to the bottom of the grater. We can fix this by using a small spoon to scrape it off back into the bowl. Once we are done removing it from the grater, we are left with a reasonable amount of ginger to work with. We can now move on to the next step of removing the ginger juice from the ginger itself. Usually, the recommended step for removing the juice from the ginger itself is to take the ginger and put it into a cheesecloth and squeeze it to remove the juice. However, since we don't have the materials for that, we are going to use a coffee filter instead, which serves this purpose just fine. After placing our coffee filter in a bowl, we can go ahead, take our ginger, and using our spoon, we can scoop it into the coffee filter. As with the other steps that we have completed so far, this is also fairly simple to get done, and we can see that as we pour the ginger into the coffee filter, the liquid is already starting to seep through and wet the bottom of the filter. Then we can go ahead and take our coffee filter and crumple it up a little bit so that it becomes a small little pouch, and we can squeeze it gently to try to get as much of the juice to come out of the ginger as possible. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here since we are using a coffee filter, not to squeeze it too hard and break it like I did here, but if it does break, it's not a very big deal. You can just go ahead and try to make sure that the ginger doesn't fall into the bowl. At least try to catch as much of it as possible. Now, we have our ramekins from before. We can go ahead and take those out. Using a small half teaspoon scoop, we can go ahead and measure out our ginger juice to spread evenly into both ramekins. We will pour roughly 1 scoop of the ginger juice into each ramekin, just enough to cover the bottom. Since this is a very small container, we don't need a very large amount of ginger juice in order to create our pudding. If you do like having a stronger ginger flavor inside your pudding dough, you can go ahead and add more juice to it. Once we are done with that, we can also go ahead and set that aside for now as we go on to the next step. For our next step, we'll begin by pouring our milk out. We need roughly 3 cups of milk for the amount of ginger pudding that we'll be making. We can also go ahead and stir in the amount of sugar that we would like to add to it. We can add as much as we want depending on how sweet you want the pudding to be. After adding it in, you must make sure to continue stirring it to make sure that the sugar is fully dissolved inside the milk. We stir it as much as possible to try to get it to dissolve, but if not, it's okay because we'll be heating it up and it will dissolve in the process. We can go ahead and turn on our fire to a medium-low heat, and then we can pour the milk into the pot gently. After pouring the milk in, we're gonna let it heat up a little bit, not to boiling, but the ideal temperature is actually to have it heat up to around 70 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 158 degrees Fahrenheit. It's okay if we go a little bit above or below, but we want to be generally within that area. After pouring in the milk, we also want to make sure that we're continuously stirring it as it's being heated up on the stovetop. Every once in a while, we can take our thermometer and put it inside the milk to make sure that we are going up to the temperature that we want. You can stir it around a little bit to make sure that it's evenly heated throughout. This is also the most important step of the process because if we heat up the milk too much, it's actually going to denature the enzyme once the milk is added to the ginger, and if we heat it up not enough, it won't activate the enzyme. So in order for the pudding to set, we need to make sure it's generally around this temperature. Measuring it again, we see that it's actually really close to 158 degrees right now, so we will go ahead and turn off the fire and remove the milk from the stovetop. This process has to be very fast because we have about 30 seconds to like a minute or two before the milk starts cooling back down again to a temperature that's less than ideal. We'll go ahead and bring the milk back to our table with our ramekins full of ginger juice. Now, the trick to creating this pudding is to pour the milk from a slightly higher elevation. That way, when it touches the ginger juice, there's actually some mixing going on there in which the milk evenly spreads out. We'll go ahead and do this for every single ramekin. If it's not evenly spread out enough, you can actually go ahead and stir it a little bit if you'd like to have the ginger evenly distributed. Afterwards, we can let it rest for approximately 5 to 10 minutes. If you put it in the fridge, it will become firmer, but if you leave it out, it would also solidify on its own as well. Now, we can see that each of the puddings have solidified to a pudding-like texture compared to the liquid state that they were in previously. If you shake it around a little bit, you will notice that it's actually still a very soft pudding compared to most other puddings. It's actually has a lot more, the texture has a lot more in common with tofu than like with actual like jello or something of that sort. The trick to testing whether or not the pudding is ready to be eaten is by actually taking a very light spoon and resting it on top of the pudding. If it sits there, then that means the pudding is actually already set and is ready to be eaten. So we have successfully made ginger milk pudding, and that concludes the tutorial for the simple dessert. I hope you guys have the time to go ahead and feel inspired to create this on your own. In the meantime, enjoy!